Okay, so hello everybody. Welcome to one of the new lectures that the CMCC is organizing, also along the celebrations of 20 years since CMCC was first established. I'm going to be introducing Alessandra Giannini, who's working at the École normale supérieure in Paris, France. And she's going to talk about the late 20th century Sahel drought, and we'll hear about whether it's an obvious candidate for attribution. So I'm Anna Pirani. I'm a program director and senior scientist at CMCC, and I'll be moderating this event. So just to quickly introduce CMCC, since we're joined by many colleagues from outside our organization, it's an organization that's been addressing climate sciences and is projecting itself to be at the forefront of climate science research in this century. And we're a leading research center that's focused on understanding the interaction between climate change and society, as well as economics and development. And we have a very broad network that we've been building through our history of collaboration, international research activities and partnerships that we're very proud of, including with international organizations. And our mission is to go from model development, where we classically come from, to the development of actionable solutions. And we do this by advancing interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary analyses and interdisciplinary research. We combine advanced climate modeling, impact assessment, and environmental economics approaches, and we support science-driven adaptation and mitigation actions through our science-based evidence, basically. We have a research infrastructure that tries to promote cross-cutting and multidisciplinary advances and competencies, and that links first-class climate modeling with these disciplines in relation to impact modeling and environmental economics. We have 3 multidisciplinary research institutes for strategic programs on frontier topics, and infrastructure that is dedicated to supporting the research that we're doing to study climate change. And we also have 2 specialized centers on digital innovation and high-level education and training. So just to walk you through the structure. So the 3 institutes are built through a grouping of research divisions where the research is happening, and the institutes bring together these different research activities in 3 veins, 3 pillars. One is advancing Earth system predictions, and the second is about building our knowledge and analyses capabilities to strengthen climate resilience. And the third is about advancing sustainable and socially enhancing climate strategies, looking at environmental and climate change economics. And then we have these 4 strategic programs, which have been just recently established on frontier topics, that again are really scoped to bring together the competencies of CMCC to bring meaningful information and progress on topics related to the planetary biogeochemical industrial carbon cycle integration. We're treating global coasts as a new frontier, and we have a new program predicting socioeconomic outcomes of climate change, which is the one I'm leading. And we're establishing now a new program that will integrate AI and machine learning into the modeling chain. And as I said earlier, we have the backbone of the research is coming through our centers and the infrastructure that they provide, one on high performance computing, and then we have a center on advanced digital innovation, and we have a center on training and education, which works very much also at the science policy interface. So here we are. This is the 4th CMCC lecture in our new series. And here we're bringing together with us leading scientists from around the world to discuss their research, the novel findings from their research, and provoke a discussion with us and you together during our 1 hour together. So feel free to look up the previous lectures. We have here the QR code that will take you to their recordings. So housekeeping rules in this session, we will just be using the Q&A for you to ask questions. So I've known Alessandra Giannini for a long time. It's really lovely to see her again in person this time. Just to give you a flavor of her journey in her career, she started with a physics degree at the university in Milan, and then she moved straight into addressing topics related to climate by working with Stefano Tibaldi and Susanna Corti here in Bologna with her thesis. Then she moved to the US and she undertook a PhD in Earth and Environmental Sciences at Columbia University. After that, Alessandra was a postdoc at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, NCAR, and then she joined the International Research Institute for Climate and Society, IRI, in 2023. So in 2017, she moved to France. She was one of the first laureates of the Make Our Planet Great Again initiative. And she joined the Laboratoire de Météorologie Dynamique at the École normale supérieure in Paris. And it's wonderful that in 2020, she became a full professor of the École normale supérieure in geosciences. And in addition, she's also leading the Center of on Formation, on Education, on the Environment and Society, which is an interdisciplinary initiative to bring the sciences around climate change and integrate knowledge across the sciences for students coming from scientific and humanities studies. And throughout her career, she's worked on tropical climate dynamics and teleconnections, specifically looking at issues related to the African climate, the role of El Niño Southern Oscillation, understanding the monsoon, and climate change. And then how these factors affect society, particularly food security, and also in general, how scientific findings and the role of science, what that role is in the context of society and bringing the knowledge into the policy sphere. So over to Alessandra, who will talk about the 20th century Sahelian drought, and she'll tell us about why this is an obvious candidate for attribution. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to start with a very few words of thanks to Simona Masina, first of all, and my sister Valentina, who invited me, and to Anna, who is moderating. I'm looking forward to the discussion. I love, just as another way of introducing this topic and the broader context, I would also like to thank, I don't want to drop names. I could spend the whole hour thanking all the people that I've encountered along this journey. But I wanted to thank in particular a few colleagues at ENS in the humanities, colleagues in geography, Leila Vignal, and colleagues in history of the environment, Stéphane Van Dam and Hélène Blais, because what I would like to talk to you about today has a core of climate science, but also some extensions into different disciplines, and hoping that this broader context brings some clarity to answering this question of the attribution of late 20th century Sahel drought, meaning what were the causes, what was the cause of droughts in the Sahel. And I realize now, oh no, okay, I have a map to show you where the Sahel is, just in case you're not familiar with it. So there's droughts in the Sahel that occurred during the 1970s and 80s. And I thought really that I would, that I would try and be broad and discuss the topic in its broadest outlines, the way it's been discussed in the past of 50 years or so, even though there are even historically there's roots that date even further back than the 70s and 80s. And so just as a way of a summary, in a way, I do want to give you the climate scientist's perspective on what the cause of Sahel drought was in the late 20th century. And I'll give you the the history of how we came to understand what this cause was, and specifically discussing the two main hypotheses that have been discussed in the past 50 years. I would like to really try and bring some clarity to what the conclusions are about the relevance of these two hypotheses that are in a way complementary. One is local, the other is global. One is terrestrial, the other oceanic. And then there's elements of attribution, and so understanding what the causes are, and some actually implicate the global south, specifically Sahelian populations, and the other one actually implicates global emissions, and so particularly the global north. And so these two hypotheses, the causes of Sahelian droughts are then one view, one way of looking at Sahel drought is to consider the argument that was first put forth by Jules Charney in the 70s, right after the first droughts in the early 70s, of a biogeophysical feedback. And the second hypothesis is, so that's the local terrestrial implicating the global south hypothesis. The alternate, the complementary hypothesis is one that says that oceanic influence actually dominates the climate of this region. And that's a global hypothesis, global causes, oceanic causes, and implicating the global north more generally. But so I will give you this context, but and then there will be a core element of climate science that goes through especially the last, let's say, 20 years of science on this topic, to get to the point of attributing, so determining the causes, and then we can discuss also more broader topics about in part responsibility and agency, but also especially adaptation. Okay, and so I think one element that I think I mean, at least as a climate scientist, I find I have the hardest time explaining what climate science and climate dynamics, what does it mean, is that while it's true that we have some, daily experience of climate, there are elements of climate science that really are beyond go beyond our senses, and are really happen at a scale that we cannot comprehend, we cannot have a direct experience of. And so in regards to drought in the Sahel and precipitation in the Sahel, and the dynamics of the climate of the Sahel, the main element that's, I think, in part is difficult to apprehend is the fact that the scales of the processes are really hemispheric. They're really very large scale, and they connect ocean and atmosphere. And so here what I'm quoting is really quotes in quotation marks from this paper by Trembert that does some back of the envelope calculations to try and explain that, in fact, whatever rains pretty much at any place in the globe has to be converged from very far, from thousands of kilometers away. And so the humidity that is locally present in the atmosphere, or the evaporation that can come from the soil, from the surface, cannot possibly account for the rain rates of when it rains. So this really large-scale process of converging humidity into a region is a critical element for understanding this climate. So the way that this manifests in the Sahel that I tried to depict in this, what I took this figure from a synthesis, I think it's from the AMA project, from a synthesis paper. It's kind of a distorted geography of Africa, but the idea is that in this case, it's the monsoon, the West African monsoon, that brings rain to the region. And the scales of this monsoon are really hemispheric. So what I'm showing you here is it's an animation of the seasonal cycle of precipitation. So the green color is precipitation, and then with low-level winds. So signifying, so the rains reach the Sahel in our summertime, July, August, September, and they are accompanied, the part of the system, part of this West African monsoon system that manifests in southwesterly winds from the southwest. into the region. And it's these winds that converge the moisture that can rain in the Sahel. Okay, and so I guess maybe I'm going to skip, but for me, or maybe the few people who are in the room can raise their hands and tell me which, or tell us which of these time series they think does not represent the evolution of Sahelian precipitation over the 20th century. It was something to see a bit of dynamics if there was any dynamics. I'll skip it. We'll come back because I think by the end of this lecture you will know which one is the what do you call it, like the intruder in the room. Okay, so let me start. Okay, this is a one Sahelian time series that shows from the 50s to the 2010s the evolution of anomalies in Sahelian precipitation. And these are standardized anomalies, and essentially to identify the phases of Sahelian climate over the second half of the 20th century. The climate of the Sahel was characterized by these decades of very wet, actually abundant rains in the 50s and 60s, and then a somewhat abrupt switch to persistent droughts in the 70s and 80s, with really extreme drought events in 72, 73, and then 82, 83, 84. I don't know if the cursor works. Yeah, these years. So a wet epoch, a dry epoch, and now we're in this variable epoch where we see a lot of the easiest way to characterize the end of this time series is the alternation of wet and dry years. This is from observations from the region. So observations collected by the Met services and into a regional climate center. Okay, so the local or global origin. I've been working on this topic for 20 or some years. And at some point, discussing with actually some historians, they convinced me that I could skip over the Charney biogeophysical feedback idea because it was everybody kind of knew that it was surpassed. But I don't think that's the case anymore. So I'll go through this 50 years of history of understanding Sahelian droughts. And so, first of all, observations. Again, this is a summary figure of trends in the linear trend in precipitation over the 20th century, taken from the fourth IPCC report. And the arrow there points to the Sahel, so the southern edge of the Sahara Desert, where we see over the entire 20th century a decrease in precipitation, so a decline, a negative trend. That's quite consistent across the region, large scale, and a certain magnitude here given in percent change per century. And so in the 70s and 80s, when this drought manifested and its persistence manifested, these were the questions that people asked. Why is this drought persisting? Why are there consecutive years of drought? Why was it wet and then now it's become dry and this drought persists? Is it irreversible? And so Charney in the early 70s put forth this idea that there may be a biogeophysical feedback. And the starting point of this biogeophysical feedback was that there was a bearing of the soils that was human-induced, so that human activity or mismanagement of the vegetation cover would bear the soils, and then there would be a land atmosphere feedback that would induce a reduction in precipitation. And then from then on, you can see that it's a positive feedback. You started, even if the starting point was human activity, once you reduced precipitation, then vegetation reduced, and you were locked into this feedback loop of decreasing precipitation and vegetation. And the initial idea was that it was by bearing the soils to increase surface albedo, and so that reduced the energy available in the atmospheric column, and so the energy to overturn the column and produce deep convection. And so Charney actually is also, because it's been so long that the community has worked on this topic, there's also definitely a history of models becoming more complex and the computing power increasing. But Charney himself ran some simulations with a climate model in the 70s. And so this small figure here at the bottom, this is really the first page of this article that shows the result, the output of a model simulation that ran for a few weeks with different albedos on the Sahelian region, and so then simulated the precipitation, and so when you increase the albedo, you decrease precipitation. And so this, from the 70s on, this was repeated many, many times. I mean, as models increased in complexity, because it also became a question not just of albedo, but also possibly of other land atmosphere mechanisms involving soil moisture or vegetation or all kinds of other feedbacks, and not just a direct energy budget feedback. And so I'll just show you one of the, at least from the time that I started working on this, one of the final points. I mean, at least I consider it to be final, because I think it's, in my view, it's a bit of an end of the line of what we can get from models with this configuration and these kinds of simulations and experiments. And so the ending point here is that this is obviously in the early 2000s, a much more complex model than what Charney used. But I mean, the physics is essentially the same. So if you impose something like an observed change in vegetation cover, then you get, which is what's depicted on the left. So a decrease in broadleaf tree or an increase in bare soils. You get a reduction in precipitation. So the feedback can work, this Charney feedback can work, but it can only explain a portion of the change in precipitation that was observed. So for these authors, Chris Taylor and colleagues, it's a decrease of 5% compared to the observed decrease that was more of the order of 15 to 30%, let's say. And so what are the weaknesses? It's in my view, in regards to how far models can take it in this setup with these kinds of simulations, it's a bit of an impasse. But let me start. Let me make just an intermediate point here to show that with satellites we can measure albedo, and so we can quantify, for example, what is the actual albedo change between a wet and a dry year. And so that's what these authors did. And so they took a very dry year, 84, differenced it with a relatively wet year, 2003. And so you can see which way does this. The sign here goes to show that if you increase albedo, you cool. And that's why the blue. And so by increasing albedo, you cool the land surface and you decrease precipitation. But if you impose realistic changes in albedo, you cannot get, as we said, the observed change in precipitation. So in my view, we're kind of stuck with this approach, because we know that Sahelian droughts, the decrease that was measured between the wet and the dry epochs is more of the order of 15 to 30%, depending exactly on where you are in the region. And the albedo change is of the order given by the previous slide. And so if you want to get the full response in precipitation in models, you have to amplify the albedo change, or else you don't get the change that was observed. On the other hand, we also know that models in general, maybe not all models, but certainly a good number of models, have a hard time quantifying reproducing the actual amplitude of precipitation variation. And so that's why I say we're stuck. There's no way to get to the end of this and say exactly what contribution does land use change have on the droughts, on the amplitude of the droughts. But we can look at other things. And so, for example, so with this hypothesis that there was a biogeophysical feedback that could explain the persistence of drought, was then the idea that the region, the Sahelian region, was being desertified. And that meant that the Sahara Desert was encroaching onto the Sahel, and so moving, migrating southwards. And this idea should have been put to rest by the first satellite observations I'm showing you here, results from a paper from 1991. So the first about 10 years of satellite observations of vegetation cover, what we know now as NDVI, the normalized difference vegetation index. Show, what do we show here? What I'm showing you here on the left is the time series of Sahel precipitation. On the right, I'm satellite observations of NDVI at the in the desert where it's 0, and then at the desert margin. And so you can kind of see that it varies. How do I reduce this thing? Okay. That it varies, and then specifically here you can see that NDVI is very low in this very dry 1984 year, but you can also see that it varies, and in fact it varies with rainfall. Okay, so we just have a correlation between vegetation cover and precipitation. There's no way that we can actually measure a cause or just define what the cause is, but oops, okay. But what we know is what these satellite observations that started in the early 80s, so started during the period of during the driest years of in the Sahel. What they show actually in the green line is an increase in NDVI, in vegetation cover, which in part goes hand in hand with an increase, a recovery, what's called the partial recovery of the rains in the blue bars. Okay, we couldn't have this if the reason for persistence really was this biogeophysical feedback, because there's no coming back from this positive feedback. Okay, so we have to explain the greening differently. And so that's on the left. On the right is another measure that people use to look at, to try and understand this what's called the regreening of the Sahel. And this is actually the residual NDVI once the direct influence of precipitation, the direct correlation with precipitation is removed. And what this shows then is that there is residual greening in the Sahel once this direct relationship between precipitation and vegetation cover is removed, meaning that hinting at the idea that there could be other processes, perhaps a different kind of human activity explaining what is mostly a regreening. I'll come back to that, but to kind of give an element of conclusion or discussion for this part is then, and it's the question that I'm posing here, is that in fact there's quite a bit of work in social sciences on the left and in the history of the environment in the middle, and then something kind of more interdisciplinary and encompassing different approaches and perspective on the issue of desertification. Is the idea that in the end, what all these elements bring to the discussion is the idea that in fact we Westerners or Northerners actually misreads the environment. We don't really understand why vegetation cover has a certain spatial dimension to it. Why is it that there are parts that are more forested or less forested? What the use of the landscape actually is, and we did this in more forested and vegetated regions of closer to the Gulf of Guinea in West Africa, but also in the drylands of the Mediterranean in Northern Africa. And so the question is really, are we imposing, in a way, our way of interpreting and reading our environment in in Europe, but also in this case, there's a parallel to the Dust Bowl in the US. How our ideas about how we interpret environmental change, how are they translated and transferred from one region to the other without really much of an understanding of the social elements and the social dynamics, or the dynamics of how environments are populated, appropriated, and used. Okay, so that's the, yeah, I hope it's clear, well, so far. So now, let me now, so then that was kind of an introduction of where we were with the Charney hypothesis, of the first hypothesis trying to explain the cause of Sahelian drought. Now, the second part, now I'm going to switch into the more climate science aspects. And so I showed you the top panel first before. So that's the view of the trend over the 20th century in the top. The bottom panel actually shows the more recent trends since 1979. So kind of like the peak of the droughts and out of the droughts. And so it shows a less marked trend, but a trend that goes in the opposite direction. So a trend that goes in the direction of a partial recovery of the rains. So when we address this question in climatic terms, that's what we have to try and understand, this evolution. And now I'm giving you the answer, but we have to try and understand what is it that can explain that over the 20th century there's a decline in. And then in a more recent period, actually there's a reversal and a recovery. And so what explains this is actually not so, this is looking at the alternatives to Charney's hypothesis. In fact, the conclusion is that it's actually what explains drought in the Sahel is something that's bigger than the Sahel, and that encompasses a larger spatial and temporal scale, and it's a scale that involves the oceans as the main driver of the climate of this region. And so what I'm showing you here in red is another trace of observed Sahelian rainfall variation since 1930 to 2000. And in blue is the trace that a climate model, a model of the atmosphere can simulate if the only information about the real world we feed to the model is global sea surface temperatures. Okay, I think it speaks for itself. And so that's where we are with understanding the long-term evolution. And so this setup in the model, so an atmospheric model with observed sea surface temperatures, can account for the wet phase in the 50s and 60s, and then the abrupt shift to a dry, persistent drought in the 70s and 80s. And then what looks like maybe a recovery at the end here. Okay, what's interesting with regards to, so how do we fit then these two hypotheses? How do we make sense of them holistically in a way? Is that here on the left, I'm showing you the same figures that I just showed you. On the right, with this climate model, so a global atmosphere model, you can also run the experiment of cutting off the land-atmosphere interaction. And that's done in the red curve on the right, and which goes to show that if the dominant influence is the ocean, and so it's the ocean that actually says this is a wet phase, that's a dry phase, the land atmosphere interaction, when it kicks in, actually amplifies the wet, especially the dry phase, it seems here, which is an interesting result in a way that I think would deserve more attention that we haven't, than what it's been given so far. So Charney's feedback works, but it's secondary to the dominant oceanic influence. And then we can ask what oceans? And so what we can do is just, what's done here is a regression of the Sahelian rainfall time series on the observed sea surface temperatures that forced the model. And what this shows is two things. There's one element of what's there is a warming of the Indian Ocean. And what's not there in retrospect is the fact that there's no warming in the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, so this can be this oceanic influence, then the simplest way to make sense of it is to take these two elements precisely. And this is something, as you may have noticed, I skipped from 2003 to 2013, so things evolve slowly, but one way to synthesize this oceanic influence on Sahelian rainfall is to say, well, those two elements are the North Atlantic, because it's the source of the moisture for the West African monsoon, and the global tropics. And so if we do a simple difference of these two, the North Atlantic subtropical ocean, subtropical North Atlantic minus global tropical oceans, then we can correlate this simple sea surface temperature index with Sahelian rainfall, which is what's done here. And coloring the dots just based on the years, then you see the wet phase is when the North Atlantic was consistently wetter than the global tropics, and the North Atlantic was warmer and the Sahel was wetter. And the dry phase was when the North Atlantic was consistently cooler than the global tropics and the Sahel was drier as a consequence. And now we're kind of shifting in between these two in this variable regime. And this kind of argument, so the idea being that global tropical oceans, actually the global temperature of the global tropical oceans, it should be the oceans where there's deep convection in the global tropics, sets the a global threshold for convection, and that in this specific case of the Sahel, it's the moisture that is converged from the Atlantic that allows for this threshold to be met or not. And so if enough moisture is converged from the Atlantic, then the threshold is met and it rains in the Sahel. And if not, the Sahel is drier than usual. And these are arguments that have been used by Gabe Vecchi, for example, and colleagues to discuss the influence of the Atlantic on hurricanes, and also more recently by Michel Lheureux and colleagues at NOAA to understand how ENSO is evolving. Okay, to get to the point of attribution, then this is, trying to go through the physical processes, but the idea is to use the same simulations that are used by the IPCC. And so use the historical simulations are simulations of past climates that are actually forced. So these are global coupled models, and so global ocean and atmosphere are a model, a coherent model in itself. And what's prescribed in this case is the external forcing, any external forcing that can affect the Earth's energy budget. And so in this domain, we distinguish natural forcings from anthropogenic forcings. And so natural processes that can affect the top of the atmosphere energy budget are variations in insolation, and also especially volcanic eruptions. And anthropogenic forcings are emissions of greenhouse gases, aerosols, ozone, all kinds of pollutants. And also potentially land use change is included in some of the models. And so the idea is to see whether these forcings can actually explain some of the observed variations in the climates. And so the IPCC class models, so these global couple models, have actually been simulating something like a Sahelian drought since the 4th assessment report. And so this is work with Michela Biasutti that shows the change in precipitation over this really extended Sahelian into the Atlantic intertropical convergence zone band. So showing a decline at the end of the 20th century, a decrease at the end of the 20th century compared to pre-industrial. So in the simulations with all the external forcings compared to simulations without the external forcings changing. And so the top panel shows the decline in precipitation, and the bottom panel shows the accompanying change in temperature simulated by these models. And in a way, you can see here there's elements of an Indian Ocean warming, especially, and a North Atlantic not warming, as was the case in the observed sea surface temperatures. And so the way to attribute then this that is more process driven, or perhaps you could call it more like a storyline approach, is to say again that the warming of the global tropical oceans can be reconducted or attributed to greenhouse gas emissions. And the not warming of the North Atlantic, the absence of warming of the North Atlantic, is consistent with the influence of sulfate aerosols, which reflect solar radiation, and so it can inhibit the warming over this period. Okay, so that was the fourth assessment report. Models for the fifth assessment report can actually, in some ways, actually show the entire evolution here of the 20th century in these simulations with all the historical forcings. And so the red here is still observations. Yellow is the multi-model mean of order of 30 models. And the green, the thin green lines are the individual models. And so what I would point out to you here is the fact that there's a decline in the multi-model ensemble. The decline starts earlier, starts in the 50s actually. There's a marked decline from the 50s to the 80s or so, and then a recovery. And what's really remarkable of these simulations also is that multi-model mean shows a very dry year in 1982, which is related to the eruption of El Chichon. And so really shows that this sulfate aerosol forcing, whether it's natural in this specific event, and longer term in the sulfate aerosol from combustion of coal, especially, actually work to the extent that they work to cool the North Atlantic. They have the same impact on Sahelian precipitation. Okay, I'm going a bit over, I think. Well, so let me conclude this. Then the conclusion of this climate science part is that then we can attribute physically, we can attribute the causes of Sahel drought in two steps. We can first say that it was the oceans, the sea surface temperatures, that caused the droughts of the 70s and 80s. And so that the cause of the droughts is not to be found locally on the continents, but in the oceans. And then the second step consists in attributing these changes in sea surface temperatures to the influence of emissions of sulfate aerosols and greenhouse gases. And now the recovery now then can be understood in similar terms, because we've taken out the aerosols now. We've strongly reduced sulfate aerosol emissions in around the North Atlantic basin with legislation to reduce pollution, which is partly related to acid rains, but also human health and also environmental health issues that came to the fore in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so now we have unabated warming of especially the North Atlantic. And so we're in this recovery mode of precipitation in the Sahel. I don't know if there's a time limit here.
Maybe even another 5 minutes.
Yeah,
You should
I
wrap up.
I would like to wrap. Yeah. Okay, so in fact, these I would say that this climate knowledge, this knowledge of how the climate system works, we could actually discuss all elements of all aspects of climate change negotiations, but I'll focus on adaptation to come back to the question of what caused the Sahelian droughts and what is the role of local populations in in this whole process. And so if we come back to this question of the regreening, I kind of already pointed out to you that this figure on the right could be read to mean that there's a regreening in excess of what is expected from a linear relationship with precipitation. So now that rainfall is recovering, actually vegetation cover is recovering more than expected from rainfall. And so this has actually, this could be explained in terms of how in locations, populations reacted to the idea that, they had been causing drought and desertification. And the way that they did that was to go back in places to their own knowledge in terms of land use management, their local knowledge in land use management. And in doing so, actually facilitated the recovery of vegetation cover. And so what is called into the discussion is are terms like this: agroecology, agroforestry, and soil and water conservation. And these are practices that actually in places, I mean, there's a very large literature that studies these elements and the impacts of this, of local knowledge on land use cover. There's very well, not this one, I'll tell you what this one is in a moment. There's very well known elements, for example, that point to places, regions of Niger, where agroforestry really took on in the 80s and 90s. And now it can be clearly seen from satellite what the vegetation recovery actually amounts to. And conversely, this is a bit of the lore and of the region. In parts of northern Burkina Faso, what is well known is all manners of soil and water conservation. And this is a more recent example that I stumbled upon on a field trip. And this is actually in Senegal, not far from Dakar, on the Thiès Plateau. You can clearly see that there is erosion going bottom left to top right. And then there's stone contours going across this erosion front line that were put in place to try and reduce the runoff and the erosion. And so it's these kinds of bare bones interventions that can actually change the landscape. And I'll show you another example from my field notes, so to speak. This is on the other side of the Sahel in Ethiopia. What I was showing was just some pretty photos of backbreaking work to reduce land degradation, and that was the case in Ethiopia. Can I move this slide? Okay, and so it's known. There is a very wealthy literature that shows how this works and the extent. It's not so easy, perhaps, to figure out what the extent is of these interventions, because often enough, sometimes they were promoted by development projects, other times they were taken on kind of by word of mouth or just by imitating what worked elsewhere. But the idea is that perhaps they should, in any case, they should be considered, they should be really given full consideration, this local knowledge in the management of land resources, because we're moving now in the direction. It started again? No, not me. Anyways, I only have words from now on, so I can go without the slides. Okay, what I was saying was that one way of thinking adaptation would be of thinking to go back to actually what the response to drought and desertification was, and assess the extent to which these techniques based on local knowledge can actually be helpful to adapt to what is now manifesting more and more year after year as a more variable and a more energetic water cycle. And so more extreme events in precipitation, more flooding, but also more dry spells. And can this very efficient way of making use of rainfall that actually captures the rains and recharges the aquifers by way of all those interventions, can that be a first step to adapting at least the rural communities to a more variable water cycle? Okay. And yeah, I only had the provocative slide that nobody's gonna see in the end. I guess I'll conclude by saying that yeah, what's been interesting for me over these 20 years has been doing the climate science, but also trying to see more broadly and have a better sense of how to read the context and understand the context, and understand how drought and desertification and now flooding were actually approached locally, and the importance actually that local knowledge has of local knowledge in adapting to what people thought were drought and desertification, and now is manifesting more and more as a climatic change. So I think that's the lesson that I'm taking with me here, is that it helps to look at things from different perspectives. Perhaps also we need to, in the slide that most people are not seeing, I guess I'm calling into question the way that we as often from very far away see the Sahel, or we could be looking at regions that are remote from us. And so to what extent just the way that we kind of impose this desertification idea on the region, what are the images that we're imposing on this region, on the remote, on the global south, and should we at least be aware of what the discussions are and what the alternatives could be? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Alessandra, and I'm really sorry for you, but also online we had some connectivity issues, but hopefully you got the best out of 20 years worth of experience and the narration of the history that goes into understanding and unpacking such large scale and persistent climatic extreme conditions that affect so many people, and how we see the understanding crossing different disciplines. We see the role of different processes and feedbacks, and a lot of information around the modeling, maybe the limitations that we see in our models in representing these processes, and so let alone connecting this information to society. And it was very nice to also see back on the ground what it means, what this region is about. I have questions of my own, but I was looking at the questions coming from people online. I think we have only a few minutes. One question was I asked you two questions at once. One was about if you could explain the role of ENSO in the Sahelian drought. And the other was a question, basically, there are two different views on what is creating this greening phenomenon. One is related to these climatic feedbacks that you've described, perhaps the precipitation, and the other is more due to potential CO2 fertilization effect. So maybe I hand you over these two questions.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Yes, the first one, what is the role of ENSO? So ENSO is actually in that simplification of oceanic influence that I showed you. ENSO is included in the global tropical sea surface temperature. And so in general terms, usually a warm El Nino event, a warm ENSO or El Nino event, so warming of the tropical Pacifics, raises the threshold. In fact, this idea of raising the threshold for convection comes precisely from ENSO, from the way that ENSO dynamics has been explained in recent years. And so an El Nino normally leads to drought in the Sahel, and a La Nina to wet. It's not really visible it's not really part of the long-term trend, because because ENSO actually gives the interannual variation. So it's the part I didn't show you when I showed you the graph that had the warming of the Indian Ocean and the North Atlantic not warming. That was the longer-term shift. Once you remove the long-term shift, in fact, what you see is precisely ENSO. So the year-to-year variations are very much driven by the El Nino Southern Oscillation. The regreening,
The
yeah.
greening.
The regreening, I think that's a very good observation, and it's an open question, actually, the extent to which it could just be CO2 fertilization that's part of this greening. It's something bigger than the Sahel. I think most maps that people derive from satellite observations of vegetation, global maps, show this greening that could be fertilization. I posed the question to some experts, and I think it's not known yet the extent to which that could be. Yeah.
And then there was another question. It was quite emphatic as it was posed. Will catastrophes change, go away in the future? My question, basically building on that, is what can we say about future projections? And what kind of information can we provide usefully to these applications on the ground, which are on the one hand maybe looking at near-term activities such as the one you're illustrating in your photographs, but also maybe longer-term adaptation planning and resilience building. So maybe if you could say something about projections or seasonal to decadal information, it'd be really interesting to hear your perspectives.
Yeah. I mean, I think definitely the most basic lesson that one can draw from this is that we need to snap out of this idea that equates Sahel with drought and desertification. And this was actually pointed out to a social scientist colleague of mine who had looked at, was trying to understand vulnerability to climate in the broader context in West Africa. And she said, but this was in the early 2000s. And she was like, but people now, I mean, there's flooding going on there now. This was in the early 2000s even, and so that's the trend that we're seeing now. Actually, with this recovery comes with flooding. Now, the flooding obviously is much more than just a climatic change or a change, towards more extreme events. There's a lot of it that has to do with the built environment or how the landscapes are managed or not. But definitely, I would tend to think that. Projections are going in the direction of a stronger monsoon means more precipitation, and then with the warming comes also more extreme events, and possibly interspersed with dry spells. And so there's work being done in the region also on analyzing the CMIP simulations, but on a daily time scale, to understand. There's some observational work also that already shows. The big question actually is what you see in observation so far is what I showed you, is that this recent period is characterized by variability. Whereas the models, if you look at projections, they show a lot more of this increase more generally, especially for the central, and then for the central and eastern Sahel, and less so for the western Sahel. So there's some elements of the dynamics that may be changing also that are not like we've seen in the past. And so those are all, I hate to end it like that as a climate scientist, but those are all avenues for research.
Yeah, and there's a really nice question coming from Chiara Galeotti, and she's basically about the processes and the variability. What's the impact of AMOC? And you talked about the sea surface temperature, but there are also consequences related to changes in the strength of the AMOC, or is this something that then you see through the signal, the SST?
Right, most definitely you would see it. It would have to come in through sea surface temperatures. If AMOC really changed the sea surface temperatures of the North Atlantic, that would be the way to tie it in directly to precipitation in the Sahel. Yeah.
And then there are some questions which are going back to the way these conditions are being managed. And you mentioned at one point they had a slide with more traditional local knowledge being implemented in adaptation practices, farming practices. So somebody is asking what role NGOs are playing in promoting the revival of these types of approaches. And another question was about basically whether these sort of practices are expected to become more prevalent with a changing climate. Do you see do you have any insights about that?
I have a very general understanding of all that, and I don't have I think in a way it's difficult to really assess and quantify how widespread some of these these techniques are in the region. Definitely NGOs were, and I think are involved in the sense that in the very least, I think NGOs that were really on the ground in the 80s and realized may have worked side by side with some of these farmers that had this knowledge and would have seen what impact that had, could have then helped spread some of the, and so it's very difficult to say actually what was helped by NGOs or by external intervention and what actually kind of spread like wildfire, because from village to village people saw what the impact was and then took on this. There's also quite a bit of research. The photos that I took in northern Ethiopia, I went to that village. It was my colleagues from the University Mekelle who took me there, because they've been studying all that's going on in this village for quite a while, because it's quite a remarkable example of how impactful some of these techniques are. And there it was really small scale, but yeah, I mean, yeah, I didn't have time to. There was a photo of a well, like with a pump, and so it's this well with a pump. I mean, the hillside is kind of degraded, there's some erosion, but that day that I visited, there was no need to pump the well. The water was trickling, meaning that the aquifer was really like very close to the surface.
Okay, I have more and more questions, especially to the management dimensions. I'm very curious about the greening strategies, whether this is more large scale planning in place. But anyway, we've run out of time, and unfortunately I didn't get through all the questions that were asked. There was a question about sharing slides and things, but we'll put the registration, the recording on our lecture series website, and you can find the slides there shortly. You can watch the video again shortly. And thank you, Alessandra, for coming to visit us in Bologna at CMCC. And thank you all for joining us. Hope you have a nice lunchtime or a good rest of the day, depending where you are. Bye-bye. Thank you.